Hello and welcome to Scientists for Open Science, PLOS's ongoing campaign that brings researchers and stakeholders together from around the globe to share perspectives on open science. My name is Dan Morgan and I'm the Director of Communications and Community Relations here at PLOS, and I'm joined today by Dr. En Chee, Dr. Veronique Kiermer and Dr. Simine Vazire to have a conversation about open science and more specifically the theme of trust in science. I'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves, including your field and background and any other perspectives that you bring to this discussion. So I'll start with you, Julian.
Hi, I am a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne in Australia. I'm an applied ecologist and I mainly do spatial and ecological modeling in waterways and aimed at improving strategic planning, decision-making and management at landscape scales. And I have an interest in decision analysis, reasoning under uncertainty, and interdisciplinary research. So a lot of our work is industry engaged and sometimes has a community engagement component as well.
Cool, thanks. Over to you, Veronique.
Hi, I'm Veronique Kiermer. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at PLOS. I'm a molecular biologist by training, but I am no longer a practicing scientist. I've been working in publishing for a very long time in various editorial roles, either as journal editor or in editorial policy coordination. And so I guess that's the perspective I bring to this conversation across a number of different disciplines.
Thank you. And Simine?
Hi, I'm a psychologist in the psychology department at the University of Melbourne, and I I used to work on self-knowledge and social and personality psychology. I still do a bit, but I also work increasingly on meta-science and research methods and practices in psychology specifically, and sometimes science more broadly, including studying things like peer review and open science, things like that. And I've been a journal editor at a few different journals, going way back to with Dan founding Collabora a long time ago. And yeah, I'm also on the board of PLOS, so know a little bit about journals from that side of things as well.
Fantastic, thank you all so much. So I'll start with a few questions to get us going, and pretty basic question, and I'll aim this at you first, Simine, but what got you first interested in this kind of meta-scientific study of open science, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in research methods, and that was always my favorite thing to teach as a faculty member. I think it's a really interesting puzzle, and I find, how do we answer questions, especially in the social sciences where we can't really control our subject matter very well. I've always found that really interesting. And then in the early 2010s, my field of social and personality psychology was hit with the replication crisis and some cases of fraud and things like that. It was kind of this perfect storm of doubt and questions about credibility and whether our practices and norms in our field were adequate. And so that got me a lot more interested in well, do we deserve trust in our field? And what does it mean to earn trust and be trustworthy for a field? And how could we improve our practices? And became pretty active in that area.
Yeah. And Julian, is there a similar kind of starting point with interest in this kind of stuff, or has it just been organic?
No, I think it was very much, when the stories started coming in, when we started reading about stories where, a large proportion of landmark studies, for example, in cancer research or biomedical research, were found not to be reproducible, or only, a very small subset of them were, and that was quite shocking. Sort of quite unexpected, and I think that was my sort of entry point into understanding this and realizing that there were sort of parallel issues in other disciplines, and wondering what it meant for my own discipline. And of course, we have in our sort of research group, Professor Fiona Fiddler, who was an early sort of pioneer in this field, and she's a good friend, and she had many of these ideas, and I think we got talking about it and became interested and keen to try and help address some of these issues in our disciplines.
Veronique, can you identify an entry point or a start point to all of this thinking?
it was very much the same thing as young Anne just mentioned, that period in 2012-13, where there was a lot of discussion around lack of reproducibility and a lot of doubt introduced about the literature. And especially for me, as the perspective of a journal editor and someone interested in editorial policies, it was central to what we were doing, because there is data indicating that people tend to trust things that have been peer reviewed. And as an editor, you're responsible for this peer review. And so there is a lot of scrutiny about how we were doing and what was the problem that was affecting these studies that did not reproduce. And there was a lot of discussion about reproducibility in itself, but it brought me to open science, because it really was clear for me that the prerequisite to being able to improve things, to be able to scrutinize studies in a better way, was open science. It was the fact of the need to have access to underpinnings, to the data, the methodology, the code. All of that was absolutely critical, even for the peer reviewers. And then, even with that, you realize that when it's only 3 peer reviewers for a very complex study, you are limited in peer review, and therefore the ability for others to scrutinize that either before the paper was published. So, the practice of preprints, for example, which is an open science practice, was very important. And after the paper is published as well, and being able to bring sort of diversity of perspectives to the peer review in that way was very important. So it became very clear that open science was a prerequisite to be able to do anything better.
Obviously, there's been plenty of evidence gathered and writings on the topic. I mean, do any of you have any particular kind of call outs to a seminal work or a piece of evidence, an obvious or a counterintuitive finding that is you think has really helped move the field onwards, either in policy or in the study of this? Trust. Again, starting with you.
Yeah, I think for me, it was that Silverzan and Ullman paper of many hands make tight work that came out in 2015, and I think it was later of sort of a larger set of authors published many analysts one data set. And I don't know if people are familiar with that study. This was a study in which there were 29 teams of skilled researchers asked to analyze a single very large data set collected by a sports statistics firm across 4 major soccer leagues, I think, and asked to determine if soccer referees were more likely to give red cards to dark-skinned players. And teams were allowed to make their own decisions about how to analyze data. They shared their methodologies, that there was opportunity for peer feedback and discussion. They were allowed to update and refine their approaches. And there was such an amazing diversity of findings. It was 20, I think, of the 29 analysis found a significant correlation between dark skin and a likelihood of being red carded, but 9 of them did not. And even the effect sizes was a really pretty big range, from slightly less likely all the way up to like 3 times more likely. And so that was really quite sobering. So your starting point is the same set of data, the same question. You have skilled analysts. They're able to discuss this. It was just a really powerful demonstration for me that you can have all these starting points, and people will still make defensible to different degrees decisions in analytic choices, but they're nevertheless quite subjective, and it is a complex data set, and therefore even with this you can arrive at very different results. So that was a big wake-up call to me, and I guess that's the sort of evidence you can't unsee, and it underpins what Veronique saying about peer review. it ultimately is, I mean, it's valuable, but ultimately it's still a relatively small number of views, and it's still a relatively small set of scrutiny, and it's not quite enough to reflect what we might arrive at, especially when you have a complex data set and many caveats perhaps, and limitations in how it was collected or processed. And yeah, so that's my example. I think that really sort of wake up call.
I mean, and it goes to show that, I mean, imagine if people didn't have access to the data sets and they weren't, it wasn't a designed kind of way of studying that. That's phenomenal. Any other, so turning to Simine, and what's kind of been a seminal work for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's embarrassing, but it was actually a paper, it was a book chapter on how to write an empirical article for psychologists that was written by Darrell Bem, who you might have heard his name because he published a paper in 2011 in Social Psychology arguing that he had found evidence of ESP, of like precognition. But actually he was well respected and well known before that for his advice and mentorship and kind of writing on research practices. And so he had written this book chapter on how to write an empirical article that many of us in psychology would teach in our graduate research methods classes, and I did too. And so for me, it was a moment, I think it was probably like 2013, 14, rereading that article through the lens of, after kind of having seen these reproducibility problems and just being shocked, not only that like I had read these words and thought there was nothing wrong with them, that taught graduate students to do this. So like an example of the advice he gave, and one of the main points of his chapter is that after you've analyzed your data, you should pick the best, most interesting finding and treat that as a gem and write the whole paper in a way that provides the best setting and paints that gem in its best possible light. That's your job. The reader doesn't want to know what you intended to find, what you thought you would find, what you were looking for. The best thing you can do for the reader is to set them up to like really appreciate this gem of a finding, even if it was unexpected, and explicitly telling people to present it as expected and planned and so on. And between that and also around the same time, my field of social personality psych was having this crisis around the types of samples we use in our research. So we study humans mostly, and we almost exclusively relied on college student participants from our own universities, which tended to be not very geographically diverse or diverse in other ways. And so there was a paper around the same time in the early 2000s, I think in 2010, arguing that we should really be expanding the diversity of the populations that we studied. And I had when that came out, it got a lot of attention from people outside the field. And so we started getting questions about like, is this true? Do you really rely on college students so much? What's wrong with you? And I remember for many of us, and for me too, like for a long time, I would just be defensive and say, you don't understand, you don't get the norms in our field, you don't understand why it's okay, so on. And so for both of these things, it was like a matter of, you talk to like your aunt or just any random person and you try to defend these practices and it's not possible. And I remember having a moment, I think I was on a podcast talking about these kinds of open science things. And I was telling the interviewer, who was not a scientist, for example, that like we think it's okay to present something as planned that wasn't, where we teach our graduate students to do this. And she was just completely shocked. And she was like, in third grade, you learn that that's not okay, that scientists show their work, scientists should be honest, and so on. And so that was really, it just seeing what I had trained myself to accept as normal and acceptable was the biggest wake-up call. And that came from things like the reproducibility projects and things like that. Another really big factor for me and kind of my radicalization, I guess I would say, was becoming a journal editor and seeing the behind the scenes stuff. And maybe my experience is a bit extreme, but when I became editor-in-chief of a journal, one of the things that happened was that senior people in my field would complain about my decisions, and then I would get pushback from the boards and societies that ran the journal. For example, I got one forwarded email to me from a senior award-winning person saying that I had rejected their manuscript. They found this extremely distasteful and would not be submitting to the journal again. And my bosses were telling me this was a problem and were refusing to engage on the content of my decision, but just saying the fact that famous people are upset means you're doing your job badly. And I was just shocked that people were saying this in writing, right? This was in private, it wasn't out in the open, but still we had all gotten so used to business as usual and not putting the science first, that things like this were happening. And that was that kind of like, what have we gotten used to? You know, we've slowly been, the water's been getting hotter and hotter, we don't realize it. And then you look around and you find yourself in a pot of boiling water kind of situation.
Fascinating, thank you. I'm noting things in both what Yong En and Simine have said, which we're going to come back to, but Veronique, over to you.
But I don't think I can pinpoint sort of a seminal moment or thing. It was kind of an evolution as well. But one thing that it's been quite striking for me in biomedical research in particular is that both the benefits of open science and the trade-offs of not doing open science have been really thrown in sharp relief over what we've seen in the research around COVID-19 over the past year and a half. It's been actually, there have been some amazing examples of collaborations completely based on open practices, sharing data rapidly, sharing code, doing all on open source code, having, you know, international collaborations of scientists. The uptake of preprints in biomedical research as taken off incredibly. All of that has been, and you know, and you've seen surveys of scientists saying, well, now that I can't go to my lab because I'm in lockdown, I'm much more likely to reuse somebody else's data, and it's becoming much more. So all this need for open science became very, very obvious, and I think we've seen beautiful examples of collaborations. I mean, near where we are in San Francisco at UCSF, the Quantitative Bioscience Institute has established this like 15 labs international community. They've done the work that, you know, they're mapping networks of gene and protein interactions in cells, in disease cells versus healthy cells. And typically doing one of these maps can take 2 years, and they did it in weeks, right? Because of these practices. I mean, there was a lot of funding, there was a lot of, but you know, it was all led by this open ethos, and I think that was very important. And then on the flip side of that, we've seen things like you know, very important papers that were retracted really quickly because the data was not available, right? There was a paper in the Lancet, I believe, about the fact that hydroxychloroquine might be increasing mortality in COVID-19 patients, and that was retracted within weeks of being published because the data was not available. The data was not available for the reviewers to scrutinize it. It wasn't available for readers, and it wasn't available to all co-authors, right? And so, and the point there was importantly that because the result was so timely and so important, there were clinical trials ongoing that had to pause because of that paper. And, you know, pausing a clinical trial like that and then restarting it when the paper is retracted is an incredible waste of time and effort and energy in that situation. So I think these examples were really speaking for the benefits of open science and the drawbacks of not doing not practicing open science.
No, massive examples there. I mean, with the understanding that the answer may be to the question I'm about to ask, we need kind of statuses and scenarios like COVID where the stakes are high enough to force us to accept it. My question, based on Yong En saying, well, there's all these examples that you can't unsee, and Simine, you saying that, you know, there's the evidence of this like in writing, albeit in private. Like, what do you think holds back open science to be universally understood and adopted if we can mostly agree that it's a better science, it's a trusted science? Like, why do these things still go on?
I think part of it is that we have to balance, you know, what's ideal and best for science in a perfect world with what will keep us employed and productive and so on. And so there's the perception, and I think in some cases it's accurate, in some cases it's not, that some of these open science practices will slow us down and will take more time and so on. And so it just like, if you take, for example, sharing data, it feels a lot easier to say, oh yeah, data will be shared upon request. and worry about it if the request comes in, than to actually get the data set ready and interpretable and so on to people. There's evidence that shows that the data available upon request doesn't work. People don't reply to the request, or they say they will and then they don't follow through. And I'm totally sympathetic to that. I've had requests for like old data that was collected before I was in the habit of posting it, and it's so hard. I have to like really brace myself to do the work of getting it ready to show someone else and so on. So it's a kind of like tying ourselves to the mast, right? Why is any kind of self-control resisting impulse hard? Because there's immediate payoff to doing it the shorter, easier way. And in some cases, it's not just like gratification, but actual like employment or ability to get a grant, pay your staff, et cetera. So I think there are real incentives that pull against some of these open science practices. And then there are some misunderstandings about the costs of some of these open science practices. So people who think that it'll end up taking up more of their time, but aren't factoring in a lot of the costs in the old way of doing things that we're just so used to that we don't think of as things that slow down. And I think in terms of like the speed of discovery and so on, I think that we've gotten so used to the feeling of producing many fast discoveries in the old system. One of the things we don't factor in is that many of those are false discoveries. And if we actually made fewer quote unquote discoveries, but more of them were real, the production of knowledge would actually happen at a faster pace. It just wouldn't feel as fast as the old way where we're making a lot of discoveries, but many of them won't hold up. So if we can increase the ratio of true discoveries out of all the discoveries, then we could actually speed up the pace, even if we're producing things more slowly. So I think there's some perception issues and some reality issues about kind of the trade-offs and costs and short-term gain versus long-term gain and personal gain versus gain for science, things like that. And I don't think you have to be like a selfish person to feel that way, that many of these open science practices are too costly or you can't afford to do it. And it's especially true for early career people who are in precarious positions. So I think there are valid kind of arguments or reasons, especially given the current incentives in the field and the job market being what it is and so on.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, there are a whole set of things that apply to you as an individual researcher. And then there's a whole other set of things that are structural and institutional. As Veronique was explaining, there's there's some massive benefits, and they're incredible. The things that you can do together that you can't do on your own. Sure. And I mean, for me personally, I think the benefits are important. I consider a lot of my research is public interest research. We're aimed at doing better conservation and better environmental management. A lot of it is intended to inform decision-making. So on a personal level, I'm committed to providing a decent answer to, how do we know what we know? Why do we think that knowledge is reliable for decision-making? Right. I mean, I think we appreciate that, any good scientist should appreciate there are limits to validation that we can undertake. For example, if you're making predictions about the future or future conditions or impacts, so for me, I think the transparency is important so that there can be scrutiny and sense making by other people to help detect errors and blind spots and biases, particularly if it's going to be used for decision making, and there's different sort of costs and benefits to different groups of people, different stakeholders. So for me personally, on that level, as a researcher contributing to industry engaged research and applied research, makes sense, even though there are costs. They seem worthwhile relative to these benefits. But that's just a personal perspective. And I think, lots of other researchers, their contexts are different, and they experience a whole heap of incentives that are just completely not conducive to open science. And we discussed some of these things in a recent paper that Rose O'Dear led toward open, reliable, and transparent ecology and evolutionary biology. We tried to bring these sort of points together and illustrate the range of things that are institutional and structural and not so easy to shift. So that I think there's sort of things happening at two levels at least, and how do we start to well, I guess, discuss them, acknowledge them, get recognition of them at a range of different levels, and hopefully increase commitment to try and address them. but I think it's probably also important to say that, you know, it shouldn't be at all or nothing sort of proposition. I think it's okay if you are able to embrace certain practices and build on them. It doesn't mean that you have to, you know, go for the gold standard right from the get-go. I think that can be quite alienating for a lot of people. And it's difficult because, I mean, you have to learn a whole set of skills you have to learn about what makes something transparent. How do you do the sharing? How do you do a sharing in a way that is meaningful, that is reusable by somebody else? And there are costs associated with doing that. And you'll get better at it too, because, you know, but there is a learning curve, so that there needs to be an investment in time and effort to do that. But yeah, it shouldn't be all or nothing. We should keep pushing towards incremental improvements and building, you know, welcoming communities where we can support researchers to learn and adopt open science practice. I mean, that's what I'd like to see. And even if that's as simple as increasing the diversity of the people who start thinking about this as a problem, as an issue, and how we might, you know, devise solutions to some of these things.
Anything you'd add to that, Veronique, from your perspective?
No, I think it's very much true that there is what's best for science, and then there is the reality of what researchers are facing. And I think that's where there's really important work to be done in terms of changing the incentives, and, you know, institutions of science, you know, from journals to funders to research institutions, I think all have a role to play in either recognizing open science practice as a positive thing and providing a reward, so it's not just the negatives that have been, you know, the cost and the burden and the effort, but it's also, there is a reward associating with doing the right thing. And you know, the rules of competition between scientists. I mean, it's also very, I think another thing to note is that it's also very field specific. The norms of different disciplines are evolving at different speeds, and I think that, but I am really excited to see that there are a lot of early career researchers in particular who are really interested in this. They are genuinely interested with, and you know, the thing that Simine, you were describing about, you know, how you used to teach grad students and how you're evolving that. I mean, it's because of that, right? We are in a transition where we're starting to sensitize people who come into science because they want to do good science. They want to do science for most of them don't come for an individual career idea. They come because they want to do good science. And I think that then there are the realities, they are the most vulnerable people, but they're also the people who actually want to do it in the right way. And that gives me a lot of I think, hope and energy, because I think that now it's for the other people, you know, the institutions, like this is where we need to make these changes to ensure that these new generations of scientists actually have an opportunity to do the best science that they can really do.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you know, the notion of incentives and the policies having to drive these kinds of behaviors. I think kind of what I hear you saying there, Veronique, is that we're hopefully getting to a point where people would just do this anyway, where, you know, they don't look at the instructions for authors of a particular journal, whether they require open data or not. You might just have somebody that's like, well, of course I open my data because that's my value as a scientist, rather than that's how I fit into this particular structure or policy. You know, and one of PLOS's taglines in a recent video was like, how do we get open science to be seen as an asset and not an obstacle, you know, or an administrative burden? So yeah, my question is, are we doing enough? I mean, even if we're seeing it in certain generations or certain fields, you know, what are the other ways we could try and increase this notion of this is what you just do, rather than, hey, we're asking you to do this, you know, as a condition of your grant or as a condition of getting published in this journal? To me.
Yeah, I have a potentially controversial or unpopular answer to that. And this is I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm and support for a lot of open science initiatives that are seen as carrots. And there's a reluctance to impose sticks or penalties on things that are not open. But I think that we actually do need both. And I think part of what's going to make open science practices perceived as just an expectation, something you do as a matter of course, is that when there's a lack of openness and no good reason for it, we should be more skeptical. We should have less trust in that finding. And it reminds me of, I was in a group once where we were discussing open science issues, and a very senior person in the group, was kind of pushing back against the idea that we should expect people, for example, to share their data when there's no ethical barrier to doing so. And he said, well, that's like asking researchers to give their critics ammunition. And I thought, yes, exactly. That is what open science and transparency is. And that's why we should value it. That's why we trust open work more than non-transparent work, because the researcher was willing to give their critics ammunition, was willing to get caught out if there were errors and so on. And so when someone's not willing to do that, it should be perceived in a more negative light than someone who is, again, like with taking into consideration, for example, ethical barriers to transparency, and also just, lack of training, et cetera. So we should be charitable in our interpretation, but the work is still less trustworthy than if it was presented transparently. I think, someone who asks a reader to just take their word for it is in some ways asking for special treatment. Other people are expected to show their work. Why would someone who says, no, I'm not going to show my work, just trust me? We shouldn't take that as confident. I'm not saying we ignore their claims, but it should factor into how much trust we put in their claims.
I think it's interesting as well. We've done some research on how people, how scientists trust material that they come across in the context of doing their own work, or when they are assessing other people. And there is some other research out there as well. There is a big survey from the Center for Open Science, for example, and some work from other researchers. But so peer review remains a thing that is trusted, but it's interpreted in very, very different ways, right? And then when you get people to talk about it, anecdotally, people will say that the fact that the data is available is a good sign. That means that this person is willing to be scrutinized and that's a good sign of trust. So I think that refining the signals of trust that we're using, just being peer reviewed is too blunt as a signal. It's because it's not uniform, it changes, but actually saying, trying to reshape the conversation about what people will react to in terms of saying, yes, that should be a signal of trust. And how do we then institutionalize these signals so that it becomes quite clear if someone is, or some work, from a lab is systematically very open, people will have a better, will be more inclined to trust work from these other signals. And I think that conversation around signals of trust, I think, is an important one as well, to continue evolving those.
Yeah. I don't think Simine, that the sticks are controversial, at least not to me. I'm fairly in favor of that. I'm quite shocked by the number of journals that actually have a requirement for data sharing, in which that requirement is not met, and yet the paper gets published, even though it's supposed to be a hurdle. So probably some argument for applying the stick a little more strictly in that sense. And what Veronique was saying about the signals of trust, it's true. We're already doing it informally. All of us already have our own set of sort of heuristics that we know as scientists. We know how the sausage is made. Especially one of, I forgot to mention in my introduction that I've also been a handling editor at Conservation Biology since 2013. So we all have some editorial background. We do understand, a fair bit about how the sausage is made. And so for us, we require different indicators or signals of rigor and trustworthiness. And that's everything from, as basic as transparent disclosure, any conflicts of interest, perceived conflicts of interest. To me, that's a really important marker when it comes to medical research. Anything that's sort of high stakes involves a lot of investment. And then obviously transparent explanation of all the methods, willingness to share data or materials or reagents, or and all those other sort of additional markers that shore up, whether or not something is trustworthy. And I think different disciplines have, different norms. And I think what genetics, the genetics discipline has achieved is incredibly impressive, because they've had this, almost as a standard for a while. And I think it's an ethos that seems to have, basically spread into their everyday practices. I have some friends who are oncologists, and it's really impressive how willing they are to share data. And it's particularly important, for example, for those cases where, say a disease is quite rare. You don't actually have a great deal to draw from. You do have to get to the nub of it and to share it, and to be willing to share so that others can learn and benefit from that, maybe halfway across the world. But so yeah, what they've achieved is incredibly important. I think it would be useful to try to understand how other disciplines have achieved this. I don't have a good handle on that at all, but yeah, I think that would be an interesting piece of work for someone who with the ability, maybe in meta science.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It would be really fascinating to know how they got over those obstacles that other fields are facing. I was also going to add to Veronique's point about refining the signals of trust, that I think there's another step after treating openness and transparency as a signal of trust that maybe is going to come as a feeling of moving the goalposts for people, but we should be open about, which is that transparency doesn't mean you did rigorous work, right? Transparency just means we can check how rigorous the work was. And so what I've been seeing in my field is sometimes people wanting to get credit just for being transparent and then being upset when that transparency is used against them. For example, to point out that there was flexibility in data analysis or something like that. But I mean, the whole point is that transparency doesn't guarantee a positive evaluation, it guarantees a more accurate evaluation, right? And so I think there's this difference between, yes, I do on some level trust you more if you're transparent, because I might evaluate you more negatively and you're giving me the chance to make a more calibrated evaluation. And so I think this is something like that is the next step after, openness and transparency, is then using that openness and transparency to calibrate how much trust we should have in individual papers. But that comes with first saying, look, if there's not even that transparency, then we shouldn't, the amount of trust we can have is pretty limited.
Mm-hmm. If I might add to that, I think there is also, we're talking about trust with an inference that it might have been, badly done or something. But I think there are also questions of, sometimes, I mean, we see that in molecular biology, in biomedical sciences a lot, especially when it's very complex systems. You get different results, right? People study similar systems, but and they get different. And unless you can really go down to understand all the different parameters between these two things, you might not understand why it's. And at that point, if you have that, and I think it's important. It's also then important for the more general public when you say, well, you told me drinking coffee was bad and now drinking coffee is good. What's the thing? And I mean, this is a caricature, of course, but you have these things that are, and we've seen that, I mean, with the COVID-19 as well, as more knowledge comes in, as in different situations, we're not quite sure, the things evolve. And so there is also this, the fact that science is not a linear process, and that it is evolving constantly. And I think that when we talk about trust with the public, it's also understanding that there is this culture of critique within science, which is really important. And it's enabled by openness, but then it needs to do its job and really be that critique of each other as well, because that's how science functions. But I do think that there is also a concern about that at the moment, because it might reflect badly on the public's understanding of science is on the trust in science.
Yeah, well, I think without transparency, it's very hard for people outside to tell the difference between legitimate reversals. You know, we used to think this and now we think that, and both were the best evidence at the time, versus sloppy science fraud, things like that, where it's like that should never have been a legitimate claim in the first place. And I see a lot of people saying, you know, the public needs to understand that errors in science are normal. If we want to be able to say that, and I think it's a very important message, that we need to say, but sometimes we're going to make errors that were bad and we shouldn't have made, and we will be accountable for those. So we're not just asking you to take any error in science as normal, and science is in fact, like, you shouldn't be criticized no matter how many times we get it wrong. There's some kinds of getting it wrong that are bad and we're responsible for, and we ought to be accountable and fix that problem. And without transparency, I think we can't ask the public to just trust that errors are normal in science.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a fascinating tension, isn't it? It's like, you know, going back to what you're saying, getting credit, we want to give credit for transparency, but we also need to be able to criticize the things we find via transparency. Young-En, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, all of this makes me think about Helen Longino, who's a philosopher of science and a science of social knowledge. And I think a lot of what we're talking about here is, you know, are we creating the conditions and social practices that allow all the good and critical parts of science to function and flourish? You know, are we, you know, the transparency is critical for that scrutiny and critical interaction. It helps us make public the standards of evaluation. And then, you know, opening up things, you say, for example, post-publication review, you know, enables other people to participate so that you have this sort of equality of intellectual authority. And then ultimately, it must be possible that people must take up this critique and do something with it, you know, whether that's correcting an error or retracting a paper or disowning a particular claim. So I think, you know, without these better practices, you just can't get at any of these mechanics that actually help us, you know, evaluate and process a whole bunch of studies and practice and claims that come out of them. Yeah, so I think that's sort of what I was musing on when Simine and Veronique were speaking.
I mean, it's clear to me that this conversation could go on for many hours and be repeated over several days. So with the caveat that this may, let's see if we can make this not the last time the four of us, and maybe including even more people, get together to talk about these things. In the interest of time and accessible recording, let's finish with some final remarks. And, you know, I might, as glib as this may be, I guess I'd love to ask you whether, are you positive about the future? And is there, or is there anything that you've seen that you've been particularly kind of delighted, or you've enjoyed seeing, you know, recently, you know, in terms of kind of the advancement of trust in science and open science? Let's go with the original order. Start with the Young-En. You can pass, of course, if you'd rather someone else go first.
No, that's all right. I think I am feeling relatively positive, but that's probably because I have the benefit of interacting with a community that is interested in these things. And recently, you know, we've had, you know, this new, I need to find the right acronym, is SORTI, Society for Openness, Transparency in Ecology and Evolutionary Science. And yeah, it's really energizing and positive to see lots of people embracing these ideas and providing really constructive community to learn about this in various aspects. I think the good thing is you can jump in at the different points at which you're interested, you know, whether that's in transparency or code review or preprints or post-publication review or registered studies, or I think that there is sufficient room there for lots of people to get stuck into the thing that's most relevant to them. And that's great because, you know, every scientist in their discipline operates in a slightly different context. So there are things that are likely to be more appealing to different people. So I feel relatively positive about that in my field. We still have big challenges. I think a lot of, you know, with complex studies, it just really is difficult to know at what point, you know, reproducibility fails, or is it genuinely due to genuinely sort of variable circumstances that you're never actually in the same place or conditions twice when you're you know, in a field context. It's hard enough controlling all the variables in the lab setting. You know, when you have conditions that change over space and time, plus climate changes being layered on top of that, what does that mean? And is that crucial, or you know, are other aspects of openness sufficient for us to keep moving on? So yeah.
Veronique?
I think I'm positive because I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning otherwise to do this job. I mean, I do think, I mean, I think there is a lot of, if I look back at, you know, we talked about the seminal moments at the beginning, and if you look back at, you know, the journey so far, and I mean, in one way, it feels very slow, and I think it's going to be a long journey. On the other hand, the amount of people and the diversity of people who are getting interested in this and genuinely taking an interest, but also, I mean, as I mentioned early career researchers, and I think you see that with some, you know, for example, some of the reproducibility networks have been really sort of grassroots movements, and when those grassroots movements are happening, I think it's a very good sign. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I think I'm hearing a lot of funders who are really starting to really have a reflection about this and starting to put things in place to try to change things or to study how it's done. And so I think that the interest is there to stay, and there is a long road ahead. I think there is a lot of progress to make, but it's there. And you know, if I have one hope, is that, you know, the silver lining of this complete revolution in research that we've seen over the past 2 years, that actually there is some benefits that stick from that, and that we actually see, that we learn from that, and that that some of these practices that people have started discovering, perhaps because there was such a big sort of communal goal to it, and that, you know, this balance between the individualism and the need to pay attention to your career, and so that was thrown in relief with this big global pandemic. I mean, I'm hoping that realization then can actually outlast the pandemic, and that we can see more of that and build more on that as a positive thing.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons for optimism, and I would say that for science as a whole, I'm optimistic, but I have a hard time getting out of my kind of narrow view of psychology. So I'll speak a little bit to psychology, and I think there are lessons here probably for other fields. There are probably similar currents in other fields. And what I see in psychology is a risk after this, you know, we had this decade of like really serious grappling, a lot of debates, panels at conferences, a lot of special issues, journals grappling with this. And I see still two very strong currents. One is to kind of try to sweep everything under the rug and say, like, this, we don't want to air our, you know, dirty laundry in public, or this isn't a serious problem, people are blowing out of proportion. Or another movement is to kind of declare victory and move on and say, yeah, things were bad, but now thanks to the reformers, everything's fine. And I think that that's avoiding really grappling with it and having a reckoning that we need to have. And I think there are groups, like both of you mentioned, like grassroots groups like Sortie, and in psychology, there's SIPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, and now there's an interdisciplinary group, AMOS, Association for Interdisciplinary Meta Research and Open Science, that are kind of trying to hold disciplines accountable for really grappling with this and not just sweeping it under the rug and not just moving on and saying mission accomplished, but they're mostly ECR led, which is inspiring and is exciting, but also makes you wonder where the senior people are who can afford to take more risks and who have more power to change things and change policy and so on. And so I think what is really going to determine whether these things take off and become the norm is what the senior people do. If they behind the scenes stick up for people when they're in those committee rooms making those important decisions, or whether they're throwing a wrench in the works in those situations that might be happening and we don't see it. So I hope that at a minimum they get out of the way and let the ECRs, do this thing, and ideally also support them and help them. I think it's really going to depend on that.
And I'll just use that final comment as a quick plug for the theme that's coming up on the Friday of the week that we'll be releasing. All this programming is devoted to community, and we'll be talking to some people like building communities of open science at grassroots levels. So, and this, as I said, this is an ongoing campaign. So hopefully we'll be able to coordinate talking to groups like AMOS and SIPS and Sortie over the next few months. But En Chee, Veronique Kiermer, Simine Vazire, thank you so much. And I really look forward to seeing this recorded video up on our websites. And I hope all you watching this in the comfort of your own homes or labs have enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
everyone.